And thank you for joining our latest edition of the Colloquium series. I'm very delighted today to introduce Suntosh Pillay. He is a clinical psychologist based in King Dinizulu Hospital in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal, and he is also affiliated to the University of KwaZulu-Natal as an honorary lecturer. Researcher, sorry. His academic work uses a critical and or community psychology lens located at the nexus of the psychopolitical theorization linked to race, sexuality, social justice, mental health, and identity. He's also a lead researcher for the African LGBTIQ plus Human Rights Project, a grant-funded initiative of SAISA. He has presented and published widely, including in the Lancet Global Health. He also serves on the editorial boards of PINS and SAJP. So without further ado, Santosh, I'm going to hand over to you. If I could just ask everyone to please keep questions and discussion until the end, and also to note that I will be recording this session and it will go up on our YouTube channel afterwards. Thanks.
Oh, geez, on YouTube. So I'm going to watch what I say, since this will be recorded for posterity. Firstly, thank you, Sheena, for inviting me to speak. I haven't spoken to the Stellenbosch University Psychology Department before, but glad to see many familiar names in the participant list. So it's not a completely unfamiliar audience. Um, Thanks everyone for joining this talk. I'm really hoping we can have a bit of a discussion just about the paper, slightly, I suppose, provocative topic regarding kind of, I suppose, racism and coloniality. I know racism, for example, is a hot topic right now down at Stellenbosch University as well. I'm not sure if this will really have anything to say to the issues happening back where you guys are, but certainly I think it'll stimulate some sort of discussion. So this is based on a paper that I've recently published, and I'm going to just, if you can give me a minute, just share a presentation, which I'll have. And then, yeah, I mean, I suppose it is easier to do questions at the end, rather than during the presentation. So let me just find the presentation, if you can just give me a second. Right. I'm not sure how it's looking on your end, whether you
You
can
can see
see.
it.
Are you seeing all the little slides at the bottom as well?
No, we're not. So it's just the presentation. You're good to
Oh, it's
go.
just a presentation. Okay, let me just figure out how to get it to be a little bit bigger on my end. Uh, yeah, okay, that's a bit easier. And if you don't mind, I'm using hospital Wi-Fi, which is not the most reliable. So I'm going to just turn off my camera to save some bandwidth, and I'll turn it back on when we do questions and answers and a bit of a discussion, if that's
Sure.
okay.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone. And thanks again, Sheena, for the invitation. The the presentation today is based on a paper that I've done, which I'll just show a screenshot of, which has been published in the journal Psychology of Violence. And the paper is entitled "Where Do Black Lives Matter? Coloniality, Police Violence, and Epistemic Injustices During the COVID-19 Pandemic in South Africa and the US." It was published as part of a special edition around issues around police violence and social justice, especially kind of on the heels of the George Floyd murder in the US. So I've entitled the presentation for today's purposes something slightly different from the paper's headline, which is "The Limitations of the Black Lives Matter Movement for South African Anti-Racist Activism," which is where I really feel the kind of pivot of our discussion can be. Um, And the kind of meat of the discussion is really around the murder of Collins Khosa and the epistemic injustices and silences that follow that. I must admit, it's quite a dense paper. So it's one of those topics that I think is better read kind of quietly at home, and is not the easiest to present and do justice to, I think, a lot of the kind of theoretical discussion. But I'll do my best, and we'll see how we go along. So just to contextualize the discussion, I think it needs no introduction. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 on May 25th, ironically on Africa Day, I suppose, which has some relevance later on. But George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, was murdered by a white policeman, Derek Chauvin, and that happened in Minneapolis. And it was on the heels of a very kind of petty accusation by a shopkeeper that George Floyd had used a counterfeit, I think it was a $20 bill. And the policeman then had his knee on George Floyd's neck for, I think, well over 8 minutes, which eventually resulted in his death. And commentators have noted that, George Floyd's murder was simply a continuation of unrelenting anti-Black racism in the US. I think it's no secret or surprise that the US is quite riddled with racism. But the phrase "I can't breathe" and the hashtag that followed was what really kind of symbolized this movement in some ways. And it was the phrase that George Floyd had repeatedly said and was recorded saying to the policeman before he died. Interestingly, an analysis by the New York Times actually showed that the phrase "I can't breathe" was actually uttered by at least 70 other people who over the years had died in police custody in the US, even before Floyd's murder, even though George Floyd's murder had actually kind of popularized the hashtag "I can't breathe." So I think what this shows, or what this kind of highlights, is this, I suppose, this biopolitics of breathing in some way, that when we think about breathing, breathing is never apolitical. And the focus on breath when George Floyd died was actually quite significant and important. And some of the other links that I make in the paper, but I won't speak about now, is how this ironically also happened in the early phases of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the focus on breathing and whether or not we can sustain our life through our respiratory system actually became something in sharp focus. So the idea of breathing kind of almost becoming like a metaphor for life itself drew attention to not only the kind of suffocating experiences of African Americans, but also the effects of COVID-19 at the time in May 2020. So set against these kinds of backdrops, I draw from the writer Magdalena Goska, and she writes a really interesting book on breathing itself. And she makes the links even before George Floyd's murder, all the way back in 2016, that in the context of contemporary US anti-racist and social justice struggles advocated by the Black Lives Matter movement, the phrase "I can't breathe" actually is a political slogan that has more than just symbolic meaning. Breathing as a phrase and as an articulation actually symbolizes the suffocating operations of social norms and power relations. So there's something quite, I suppose, attractive about the phrase breathing and what that might symbolize. Sandra Schulman, who was the president of the American Psychological Association at the time, described life in the US as living in a racism pandemic, obviously drawing on the phrase pandemic, which had become quite popularized under COVID-19. So these are some of the kinds of, I suppose, background events that were happening in the early stages of 2020, which got global attention. So although this was one murder of one man by one policeman, and although these instances of police violence had happened countless times before, and even though the phrase "I can't breathe" was uttered at least 70 documented times before, and even though the COVID-19 pandemic was taking global and national and international attention, there was something about the George Floyd murder that kind of captured the global imagination. And we see it in this map, and everywhere you see a little blue dot is where a protest centered around George Floyd's murder was taking place. And I think a picture speaks 1,000 words. We can see that The entire globe seemed to have been captured, but especially the global north. So if we look at America, Canada, and Europe, especially taken by the murder of George Floyd. And it became a springboard for a range of anti-racism activism and work and protests in many, many countries, including a spattering in Africa and South America and Asia, but not as much as the global north countries. But the question I asked, which prompted me in the end to do the analysis I did, was what about Collins Khosa? Because when George Floyd's murder happened, already 6 weeks before that, on the 10th of April, 20, so that's a typo. It's not 2022, it's 2020. On the 10th of April, 2020, in Johannesburg, in the township of Alexandra, Collins Khosa, a 40-year-old black man, was murdered by black police officers. And there was no global movement, no viral online outrage, no hashtags, no international or even national condemnation given to Khosa's murder. And Khosa's murder, comparatively, was actually met with silence. And if you look at the Times Live article, which describes the kind of horrific way in which Collins Khosa was murdered, it's quite shocking that there was no attention given. I mean, one report, for example, said that according to a witness affidavit, 4 police officers assaulted Khosa by pouring beer on his head, choking him, banging his head against a cement wall, hitting him with the butt of a machine gun, kicking, slapping, and punching him in the face, stomach, and ribs, and finally slamming him against the steel gate. And obviously, the story of Collins Khosa, for those who paid attention to it, hit hard at our national psyche, ravaged by a kind of history of police brutality that became a normalized feature of life under apartheid. And obviously prompting images, for example, of people like Steve Biko, notoriously killed by white apartheid-era police in the 1970s. But how do we make sense of Collins Khosa's death in relation to George Floyd's death? And how do we answer the question about why did Collins Khosa's death get more international attention and outrage than Collins Khosa's death? And I suppose the answers are not self-evident. A little bit of background, just comparing police violence in South Africa and the USA. So comparatively, South African police kill 2.5 times more people per capita compared to American police. So we have a particularly violent police force. But what they do have in common is that both countries disproportionately target Black people. So in the United States, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police compared to white people. And in South Africa, although there's no exact statistics, the SAPS does use disproportionate force when policing in Black communities, according to Bruce, who is an expert researcher in the area of police violence. But what's interesting is that in South Africa, over 80% of police officers are Black, in line with national demographics. And in America, 15% of police officers are Black, which is actually higher than the 13% African American population. So one could argue that anti-Black policing in both countries is not simply a straightforward issue of racist white police. And attempts at diversification have actually not reduced assaults on Black lives. So we need to go beyond straightforward explanations of white racism if we're going to make sense of the high levels of police violence against Black people in both countries, not just in South Africa or in America. So in my initial kind of prompting for this area, I was quite curious and disturbed by the silences, the international silences, having followed Collins Khosa's murder quite closely, particularly because of the brutal way in which he was murdered. And 6 weeks later, when George Floyd was murdered, I was quite surprised at the amount of international attention that a single person's murder had prompted in a country that was already known for high levels of racism against Black people and Black men in particular. So the questions that I had wanted to answer or try to theorize was, why were there silences after Khosa's death, but global outrage after Floyd's death? And where do these silences emanate from? In other words, who is silent when they should be speaking up? I decided to focus kind of strategically on 3 particular groups So I was interested in political silences. So did politicians speak up, especially in the South African context? Did psychologists speak up? And I suppose being a psychologist, I'm always interested in the kind of culture of silence in organized psychology, but also amongst individual psychologists more broadly, and how psychology in general, in fact, I think it needs no explanation, even during the apartheid era, tended to be silent almost as a default response. And did psychologists in this instance speak up against Collins Khosa's murder? And did academics speak up? So how did the academy respond to this? So these are the three kind of target groups I was interested in. And if there were silences, how do we theorize and make sense of these silences? And I suppose this is in some way putting the cart before the horse, but assuming that there were these silences, how do these silences trouble the appeal of Black Lives Matter? Where and when do Black Lives Matter? And whose Black Lives Matter? And I suppose that's really part of the discussion that I want to have today around Black Lives Matter and the where. So I'm interested more in the geography of Black Lives Matter and how particular spaces and places seem to enable Black Lives Matter more than others. I did kind of follow a method in uncovering this, so it wasn't just a kind of theoretical piece. I decided to do a critical literature review, similar but not as intense as a scoping review, of media statements by South African and African organizations, media statements by psychological organizations, and looking at Google Scholar articles since the 10th of April 2020. Sorry, typo again, not 2022, which is the date of Collins Khosa's murder. And I used various combinations of George Floyd and Collins Khosa with date filters. And I had done the search both on Google Scholar, and on EBSCOhost database. And the method I'd used to analyze was one by Hisha and Shannon, which is the qualitative summative content analysis. I mean, it's, I suppose, a very kind of basic method for when you simply want to count and compare keywords or content, and then followed by some sort of interpretation of the underlying context. So practically what I did was all instances where Collins Khosa or George Floyd were mentioned in search results, I counted it and I used them as initial coding categories. And then I followed that by comparisons across the different texts to look at the underlying discursive context in which those names appeared, which then enables a sort of discourse analysis ultimately. So ultimately, I'm looking at three discourses that were uncovered, I suppose, based on the kind of categories of people I was interested in, which is political silences, psychological silences, and academic silences. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time just going through these results. I don't have individual slides for each of them. But if I look at political silences, so there was a very muted response by the South African state and the governing party, the ANC, following Collins Khosa's death. They mostly responded to media questions or legal action, expressing what I would say was trite remorse in the weeks following his death. There was no evidence of any condemnation of police violence. And in fact, at the time, the defense minister, Nosiviwe Mapisa Ntakula, she urged the public not to provoke law officials, a warning she had actually repeatedly made. So in many ways, victim blaming. It was actually only on May 26th, 6 weeks later, that the South African Police Service finally released a media statement about Collins Khosa. And that was exactly one day after the murder of George Floyd. So the self-serving timing is quite conspicuous. The SAPS only released a statement the very day after George Floyd's murder shone an international spotlight on police brutality in the United States. And just 4 days later, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Musa Faki Mahmoud, condemned Floyd's murder, offering condolences to George Floyd's family and calling on the US to, and I quote, intensify their efforts to ensure the total elimination of all forms of discrimination based on race. And what's really interesting is that this was the African Union Commission's only media statement in 2020 to denounce police brutality or racism. Collins Khosa was not even mentioned, despite that happening in an African country. And this was despite the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights raising the alarm a month earlier about police brutality disguised as emergency COVID-19 measures. And she had specifically reprimanded South Africa in that statement. So, what's also really interesting and bizarre was that on June 1st, the ANC then condemned Floyd's murder and chastised the United States for placing, and I quote, a perilously low value on Black lives. And the ANC also congratulated itself for having defeated racial supremacy, I quote, and promised not to be cowed to remain silent in the face of the lynching of Black people wherever they manifest. Now, this is absolutely ironic and I would say straight-faced duplicity in that the ANC remained absolutely unresponsive up to that point and did not issue a single condemnation for any of the 11 murders committed by the police since the start of the South Africa's lockdown on March 27th. And all 11 murders, the victims were Black men. So there is a silence when murder seems to happen in our own backyard. And it was only on June 5th, at the launch of an anti-racism campaign by the ANC, that Cyril Ramaphosa finally broke his protracted silence and expressed his deepest regret at the death of Collins Khosa and 10 other South Africans. What's interesting is that by that point, more people, Black men in particular, had died at the hands of police than they had died by COVID-19, despite COVID-19 being in the country since March of that year. What's also interesting is that all four living former US presidents released statements about George Floyd. That's Barack Obama, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter. But none of South Africa's former living presidents, Jacob Zuma, Kgalema Motlanthe, Thabo Mbeki, and F.W. de Klerk, who were still alive at the time, had released any statements about Collins Khosa. So I think what this brief timeline shows by key South African organizations is that there was major disparities in moral and political attention given to Collins Khosa's murder. If we turn to psychological silences, the responsiveness of organized psychology I thought was quite important to see whether psychologists were adding their voices to issues of social relevance. So on June 3rd, SAISA, which is the Psychological Society of South Africa, weighed in and bemoaned the relationship between brutality and existing forms of marginalization. And they warned that this racism was also counterproductive to fighting COVID-19. George Floyd and Collins Khosa were cited in the SAISA statement as examples of, I quote, gross human rights violations. On the very same day, PAPU, the Pan-African Psychology Union, which is a collective of psychology organizations across Africa, issued a very brief statement of solidarity in which they said that they hope to eradicate racism and claim our common humanity in a better world. But PAPU did not name any specific people or incidents, and ironically, no related statements from African psychological associations appeared on his website. PAPU and SAISA statements appeared 53 days after Collins Khosa's death, but just 1 week after George Floyd's death. So clearly, neither of these statements were in response to the local murder of Collins Khosa, but simply as part of appearing relevant given the global outrage of George Floyd's murder. Very promptly, SAISA then hosted a webinar on the psychology of racism, and I quote, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, this swift focus that privileges the northern gaze, America, played out even in our own local societies. SAISA was the only psychology association in the world that mentioned both Khosa and Floyd in their media statement, and there was no reciprocity by any Western organizations. And I'll give some examples. The president of the American Psychological Association, the Inter-American Society of Psychology, the British Psychology Society, the Asian American Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychologists in America, the International Union of Psychological Science, the Australian Psychology Society, and the Canadian Psychology Student Society. All of these organizations released statements about George Floyd's murder, but not one of them had made any links or comparisons with the murder of Collins Khosa, or even referenced any anti-Black police brutality in South Africa. Finally, the academic silences. A search for George Floyd on Google Scholar produced 943 results, whereas a search for Collins Khosa only produced 6 results. Only one article mentioned both Collins Khosa and George Floyd, and that was written by Pierre Broad and colleagues from the University of Pretoria, despite many media articles already making the early comparisons between the two. A content analysis showed that only 532 of those articles about Floyd mentioned racism, and only 45 mentioned white police officer. So obviously what this shows is that there was a major reluctance, even when mentioning George Floyd, to make explicit links to anti-Black police brutality and white racism in America. Only 7 results mentioned Khosa and Floyd by all South African writers when I repeated the search at the end of 2020. And most of them, ironically, were articles published in a special commentary series on racism in the South African Journal of Psychology. So clearly the academic archive was almost entirely silent about Collins Khosa's death, even though there was an explosion of research looking at George Floyd. So what does this all mean? In terms of discussing these results, I use the lens of epistemic injustice, and many of you might be familiar with the concept of epistemic injustice as made popular by people like Miranda Fricker. So epistemic injustice is obviously a pattern of exclusion and silencing, whereby people, or in this case, certain contexts, are excluded in the processes and outcomes of knowledge production. And Raja, for example, very early on argued that tragedy and atrocity in the global south is seen as ordinary, while violence in the global north garners the spotlight. So epistemic injustice is, according to Miranda Fricker's model, broken up into 2 forms. The one is testimonial injustices, and the other is hermeneutical injustices. What I argue is that George Floyd and Collins Khosa were both victims of testimonial injustice, but only Collins Khosa was a victim of a hermeneutical injustice. And what do I mean by this? So a testimonial injustice is linked to individual believability. In other words, a person's ability to be a source of knowledge by expressing their words or their feelings is discredited because of prejudice. But in a hermeneutical injustice, a person's inherent ability to express themselves and make meaning is thwarted because there's a general kind of vacuum in the collective vocabulary. In other words, they don't have sufficient material power, or they are excluded in the larger discourse from even having a say. So a person is prevented from making sense of their social experience because such experiences don't even exist in the kind of wider context of meaning. So obviously they were both victims of testimonial injustices because in the first case of Collins Khosa, police and soldiers failed to believe Collins Khosa's testimony of events when they were interrogating him because he was violently attacked because they claimed that he was breaking alcohol regulations during the initial lockdown of South Africa, even though he and his brother-in-law had already purchased the alcohol and were drinking it within the confines of their own home. The police did not believe him, and this led to a fatal confrontation. So in other words, his plea to be heard was given zero credibility. And even his widow, Nomsa Monsha, speaking to Media 24, said, "The government doesn't believe that our story is true, and they don't really believe that we will get justice." So this idea of believability is at the core of a testimonial injustice. And it's the same with George Floyd. He and the 70 plus individuals who died at the hands of American police uttering the words "I can't breathe" are also victims of testimonial injustices because quite literally the police officer did not believe the fact that he could not breathe. And interestingly, even the medical examiner of Hennepin County originally said that there was no evidence of strangulation or asphyxiation in the initial medical report, despite clear cell phone footage from bystanders that the police officer had his neck had his knee on Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes. So this unwillingness to believe Floyd's pleas is clearly a testimonial injustice. However, I argue, and perhaps a little bit controversially, that George Floyd, by virtue of being American, and by virtue of having the power of the Black Lives Matter movement behind him, or at his disposal, or as a resource, was able to garner far more attention internationally, as we've seen in the analysis, specifically because certain contexts are able to gain traction in the machinery of knowledge production far faster than other contexts. And paradoxically, the Black Lives Matter movement, because of their proximity to whiteness in an American context, actually is able to garner far more political, moral, academic attention at a national and international level than the death of a Black man in a South African township context. So in that regard, poor Black people in South Africa, to put it bluntly, have far more hermeneutic justice than Black people in an American context. We can also frame this in parallel using Mills's concept of epistemologies of ignorance, because this also offers some useful insights here. And epistemologies of ignorance is where there's a very particular pattern of localized but also global, what Mills calls cognitive dysfunctions. In other words, where people strategically choose not to know. And not knowing has a function. Not knowing preserves the status quo of white racism. But as Melissa Stein also argues, drawing on epistemologies of ignorance, when we repress this impulse to question, there's this kind of vicious cycle that takes place, a cycle of epistemic neglect, which continues unchallenged and in silent collusion so that the ignorance contract remains intact. So we could argue here that there is, in fact, this international global ignorance contract. In other words, it's almost normalized and taken for granted that if someone dies in an African country, it need not make international headlines because violence, after all, is so normalized in African contexts. But if people die in an American context, and certainly if they represent a very stereotypical view of a racist, violent act where a white man kills a Black man, then certainly it's something we are almost obliged to pay attention to. So it's important that we actually call out to these assumptions, because as Nancy Tuana argues, tracing what is not known and the politics of this ignorance is actually a key element of epistemological and social and political analysis, because it has the potential to reveal the role of power in the construction of what is known and to provide a lens for the political values at work in our knowledge practices. So, in other words, there are certain geopolitical privileges that the Black Lives Matter movement has that South African spaces do not have. And that ignorance itself can actually be a form of violence. And hermeneutic injustices, to make the links, actually thrive when collective knowledge production around an issue remains obscure or seemingly irrelevant. And so domination is actually very closely tied up with systematic ignorance. And ignorance is never accidental. It's a conscious, deliberate, willful refusal to know and to actively avoid knowing something in order to maintain unequal relations of power. And so, for example, the fact that academic knowledge production has not been generated around Collins Khosa, and yet it's being generated around George Floyd. The fact that a South African Psychology Association frames a webinar on racism in relation to an issue happening in America rather than one that's local speaks to this kinds of unequal relations of power that maintain certain issues at the forefront of epistemic justice, whereas others fall in the wayside. So just to kind of wrap up, what I do say is that the focus on racism by the Black Lives Matter in the US explains George Floyd's murder, but does not adequately explain Collins Khosa's murder. where both the victim and the perpetrators are Black in a South African context. So I'm also arguing that we move beyond a straightforward focus on racism because it fails to be a useful lens in a South African context. And instead, we conceptualize these instances of violence as colonial continuities. In other words, the unrelenting and structural depersonalization of Black life under the conditions of a so-called post-colonial or post-apartheid, and I use that in inverted commas, because this merely mimics the violent oppression seen under formal colonial conditions anyway. So a historical view of why Black police officers kill Black citizens in the contemporary South Africa is rendered more intelligible if we theorize anti-Black violence as rooted in coloniality. So, as Ramon Grossfugel argues, the colonial theorist, the post in the term post-colonial implies a temporality that actually undermines the idea of colonial continuities in the present. And he says that there is no post in colonial and racial hierarchies in the world today. Instead, they are cultural and political processes that just reproduce the colonial situation without the presence of a colonial administration. So the colonized take on the features of its colonizers after attaining administrative independence. And the implications of this view is that despite an impulse by South Africans to want to use Black Lives Matter as a framework for social justice, and despite the intuitive impulse that we too should jump onto the Black Lives Matter bandwagon, I argue that Black Lives Matter actually does not serve our purposes given the geopolitical power that it has in the global North context. And so concluding comments, silence is violence and continues to be this enduring structural problem. And certainly we need to think very critically about silences and where silences come from, who is silent, why we're silent, etc. And then the reverse of that is to think about who speaks up, why we speak up, and when we speak up. And that, in summary of the argument, anti-racist activism in South Africa really must guard against simply uncritically importing northern-centric forms of protest like the Black Lives Matter movement. And just to be clear, this is not a criticism of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement serves its purpose for the context in which it was created. But it has particularities that distracts the South African gaze and actually misdirects our social justice activism away from the lived experiences of Black citizens in South Africa, which reinforces silences. So despite this quasi-universal appeal, as I've argued, the ironic proximity to whiteness within America as a unique geopolitical superpower actually gives the Black Lives Matter movement epistemic advantages that are not enjoyed elsewhere, least of all in poor South African township contexts, given the context of George Floyd's murder. I will end there. And if you'll allow me to just put a link here to the Back a Body campaign for Collins Khosa's widow and children, because there is a national movement around raising money for that. And I'll end there. Hope that gives us sufficient time for discussion, questions, comments, feedback, etc.
Thank you so much, Santosh. Such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
And I think, if I can just start off the discussions and the reflections. Towards the end in your discussions there, you were talking about around the silences, and how it speaks to the normalization or almost expectation of violence in our context. And it just got me thinking back. I mean, it was a while ago, if you want to think about hashtags, that our very own Becky Cele, Minister of Police, he said, shoot to kill and worry later. So it's almost that expectation of violence in our context. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up to my colleagues now. And if everyone could just raise their hand first, and then when I acknowledge you, you can unmute yourself. Anthea.
It was less a question or a comment and rather just to thank Santosh for this very powerful analysis and articulation. I found it very thought provoking and stimulating in terms of thinking through some of the challenges the particular challenges that we face with regard to race at Stellenbosch University, and thinking through some of the ways to respond to the lived realities of Black students and staff at our university. So thanks, Santosh. I really I valued your presentation. It's stimulated a lot of firing of neurons in my head at the moment.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Anthea. I think as a psychologist, we get excited when people say their neurons are firing.
Else? Pano.
Sheena, did you
Yes,
did you
can hear you
call
now.
on me? Okay. Hello, Santosh.
Hey, Kopana.
How are you? I know I'm ready to fight. But can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. But I know you can fight well. So I'm going to fight a little bit. But I must start where Anthea said. I really appreciate and enjoyed your talk. I just did a quick glance at the paper, which I sent to everybody who's here. Sheena had invited. Um, so you say quite a lot of things, and I, by the way, broadly I agree with them. When you say quite you make a complex argument. Sometimes it becomes quite slippery. So, if you will allow me, Sheena. So let me see. Let me just make a couple of questions to you, maybe three, in fact. One is maybe I should say this first of all. So there's a bit of I don't know in the article itself, but it felt one of the things when you began. So Hugo Canham's work on rage and Black Death came into my head quite a lot about. So and I think it's something that Claudia Rankin or maybe somebody else was at the state of Black lives is death or mourning or something like that. I forget the exact phrasing. Yeah, it could be Claudia Rankin, the poet. Anyway, please forgive me if I'm wrong, but who said that? So you have when you put towards the numbers in South Africa compared to the US. So there's a lot of Black men and Black women, by the way, in the US who die as a result of police brutality. There's even much more in South Africa, as you quite rightly say, Black men dying from the police, but also just dying. I mean, we know this from Mbeki's government a while back, and it feels like there's no mourning. You know, there's no recognition of the state in which black people exist. All Black people. I mean, but there's a particular kinds of Black people because they come in different ways. Young colored men in the Western Cape died like incredible numbers. Same young African men here, but also in other parts. In KwaZulu-Natal, I think some police districts, in Johannesburg, some police districts, and then here in the Western Cape where we are. So that's the first thing that I wanted to hear the conversation between you and what you were saying right here. That given that this is the state of our lives, that we have existed in this country, as you well know, with death for a long time now, even in the post-apartheid society. So I'm not hearing enough of that work about, well, yes, we are. So let me put some questions then. So two questions in addition to this, what I would like your comment on. And this, as I said, I have lots of comments. You end up by saying silence is what did you say it? Silence
is violence.
Is violence, but it's quite complicated, isn't it? It's a quite complicated. There's some moments where silence is protection, really. You know, it's a way of coping with the violence. So it's a and some African feminists, Black feminists here, but also elsewhere, have shown us how sometimes you have to so it's a strategic tool. Sometimes you speak, sometimes you have to be quiet. But I'm not saying this that the police are strategic in their silence or the South African government. I'm saying individuals, but also their burden. There's just so much to speak of. So I wanted to say something about that because I think I think you want to think a little bit more how you end that. Last question then to you. Last question. So I think I was part of crafting that thing in the light of racism. I don't know. I don't remember quite clearly that SAISA hosted. And I agree with you. In one sense, it was jumping on the bandwagon. It was late, but it was also trying to, it's like a marketing thing. So people know about Black Lives. They know about George Floyd. They don't know about Collins Khosa, but also Nathaniel, the young person who's disabled in Eldorado Park or somewhere, but also a lot of things. So in one sense, you're trying to bring attention in the hope that people will come and listen, and then we can talk about how to do this better. Sorry, I said the last question, but last really, this is the fourth part. But it's, and I really admire the work that you have done. I'm sure you know this. That of course we exist in a world where the Africa or South Africa is not at the center of global, epistemological, epistemic world. So attention would be paid to what happens in the West, what happens to white bodies, what happens then perhaps some extent to somebody like George Floyd before you could pay attention to the huge numbers, for instance, of Black people trying to cross from Syria, from Morocco, from Nigeria going into Europe. I mean, it's even today, so people have died. So you don't pay as much attention. So I'm not quite sure how one gets over this, except to keep on shifting the gaze like you are doing.
Thanks, Kopano. I mean, thank you so much for engaging with the paper. And I mean, I agree with all of your comments, actually. I think it's a really rich kind of contribution and kind of commentary, critical commentary on some of the issues that are raised. I mean, I actually wish we could sit down and talk about this in more detail. Yeah, I mean, I did not. So just to touch a little bit on a few of the comments, I didn't really touch on any of Hugo's work in this particular paper around Black death and mourning, but I think it's a valuable space to draw from. I think both theoretically, but also kind of in a practical way. So I write a little bit about kind of like life and identity and humanity in the paper, kind of drawing more, I suppose, traditionally on Fanon, and looking at issues of what it means to be human. So that is one aspect I draw on, but I don't think I draw specifically on issues around death and dying and mourning. But I think it's like the flip side, because I think talking about what it means to be human means talking about what it means to have a livable life, which then I suppose the flip side of that is what does it mean to mourn and to speak about death. In particular, if you'll just allow me, I mean, in the paper, I was quite fascinated with the comment by Chris Nissen from the South African Human Rights Commission, where he was criticizing the city of Cape Town for forcibly removing people. In particular, the one gentleman who was removed while taking a bath in his home in Khayelitsha and threw him naked onto the street. And Chris Nissen said, what we are asking for is for the city to follow the right processes when carrying out evictions and to do it humanely. And I spent I think I spent a paragraph or two just looking at this concept of what it means to do things humanely in that kind of context, because it kind of speaks to this issue of humanity, if we speak about what it means to do things humanely, which then speaks to issues about life. If you just excuse me while I move my laptop around because my battery's dying. The kind of second question, I completely agree with you around silence can be emotionally protective. Absolutely. Yeah, and silence, I suppose I'm arguing that silence is violence, but yeah, completely, Kupano. Silence is emotionally protective. Um, in fact, I just wrote something else around vulnerabilities and how not speaking up can be strategic also. So in fact, I completely buy into that argument as well. And I think you've answered the last question about South Africa not being at the center of our epistemic world. And the only way forward, I suppose, is to keep shifting the gaze. But I suppose, like most good discourse analysis, is to kind of expose these kinds of operations of power anyway. Which is, I suppose, what I'm hoping to do with the paper is just to expose what we all know in a way that's, I suppose, taken for granted, and exposing the taken for granted in that way.
Yep.
Thank you so much for that, Kapano. Santosh, when we were talking about when I invited you and we were talking about your presentation before coming, I did tell you that it would be interesting because it might, stimulate some discussion about what's been happening in our context recently with the racist incidences that have happened on our campus. And I see that that's been picked up in our comments by Lou Marie. Lou Marie, I don't know if you want to jump in or speak at any time. You can. But I'm just going to read out quickly what she said is that she wonders whether you have any thoughts about what's happening in Stellenbosch at the moment, and whether you can apply anything to our context. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a bit, Santosh.
The short answer is no. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to purport to be any kind of expert on racism at Stellenbosch. I mean, I think Stellenbosch has a whole bunch of particularities that I know nothing about. And my analysis, I kept it very much centered around the evidence that I had drawn out through the specific analysis of Collins Khosa and George Floyd's death. So I think I'm making a much kind of like larger argument around epistemic injustice and ignorance. Whereas, I mean, obviously these issues going on in Stellenbosch and all other places where racism exists, which is everywhere in South Africa, are important, and I suppose perhaps people might be able to draw from the many existing resources that are already out there. But I'm going to play it safe and not make any commentary on Stellenbosch, just because I just don't know enough about the context over there. Yeah. Yeah.
Sheena, this is Lou Marie. Can I quickly just say that I'm just so interested in the idea of silence as violence, because I think Kupano has said in different contexts that the silence of white academics, white students, particularly male white Afrikaans academics, what does it mean? Why are they not saying? And for me, I think people are ashamed, and then they're silent. But I would like to, maybe you can help us think, why are people silent? Why do we not have people speaking out about what's happening? And particularly as Kupano has said so articulately in many contexts, why are white people not saying more about what's happening? Is it shame? That would be one analysis, that people are so ashamed that they can't speak. And that in itself, as you've pointed out so beautifully, is a form of violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm emphasizing silence as a form of structural violence for the purposes of this paper.
Yes.
But I think, like Kopano rightly pointed out, silence is actually strategic, and silence serves different functions in different contexts. So if we look at the documented silences by most psychologists during the apartheid era, there's very particular reasons given for that silence. This myth of psychologists being this neutral, objective, ivory tower analyst that doesn't get involved in the messy politics of what's going on in society might be one reason that people construct silence as necessary. If we just look at everyday silences, like why you don't phone the police when you hear your neighbor beating up his wife, and this idea that, we want to get involved, or why we are silent when there are instances of racism in front of us. In particular, in the two instances where I've written about silence as violence, it's been very specifically around the context of organized psychology. So why psychologists in particular remain silent. And I think in our context, because whether we like it or not, we are privileged and have power by virtue of being psychologists. And I think, I'm not sure whether Spider-Man is an academic reference, but with great power comes great responsibility. So I think in this context, we need to ask ourselves, who's silent and why they're silent. And perhaps a less provocative way of saying silence is violence is asking the question, what strategic purpose is the silence serving for those who choose to be silent? Because I completely agree that silence is self-protective and self-care in many instances.
And I can see that Ronel has also added in the comments about how complex silence can be. So, also thinking of it as fear, strategy of resistance, oppression. So there's many different layers perhaps then to silence. I want to also acknowledge the hand of Jimmy, please.
Hi everyone, is my mic working?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to add just a bit of my 2 cents on why, from my view, why there's lack of, let's say, reaction in South Africa as compared to the other side of the world. And as it was said, there seems to be more of police brutality and killings in South Africa more than on the other side. Yet, this is not something that is, let's say, public knowledge or commonly known. It's as if it happens and it just passes. And when I thought of it, I was like, could it be that we recently just came from, we're fairly young from apartheid, we just came into democracy, so a new system. And when you compare this one to the past one, you say more of this brutality happened in there. So to some extent, I don't want to say desensitized, but you say it become common. This is the ordinary, as it was being said. Whereas when you look on the other side of the world, you'd say the system has been abolished for a longer time. So it is more like when brutality like that happens, it is more of a shock that after this long, do we still experience this? After so much that has been done, do we still have this? Whereas when you come to this side, which is like, this has just happened yesterday, we still have, well, a lot of politicians usually say that it's just 20-something years, guys. Probably will take time. They keep mentioning that, and also victim blaming, say that, okay, people should not provoke, should not do this and this. And on that point, what I wanted to say was, I feel like in our case of South Africa, we, as fairly young as we are, we're also missing knowledge, we're missing resources. So the people who could have, or people, the resources that are needed to make the reaction, to take action, there's not much knowledge. A lot of people still don't know how to go about this. There's still not much resources to push the movement, as we're still fairly young. There's still a lot of education that needs to happen. Still a lot of resources that need to be put in place to support this type of movement. So in a lack of knowledge, resources, it now makes, I would say, majority of people to be silent, because what else can you do? The things that you need to do or to be read, if you don't have them, and to some extent, the knowledge that you need to know that this is right, or not necessarily this is right, this is what's supposed to happen, or this is how it's supposed to happen. You don't even know that. So we're still lacking a lot of education in knowing how to go about this. When you mentioned that there was this government official who said that people should not provoke the police and whatnot, then in my mind came this idea. We are in a context where there's not much education, there's not much resources. I'm not saying aberrant behavior is okay. I'm saying in the context of our history, the way that many people know how to organize is the very same way that they are reluctant to go in that particular path because it's what it is being frowned upon, and most of us, we know that most likely how it is to turn out. But that's something that we also need to go into, organizing sit-ins or those type of things. But the thing is, we're fairly new and we don't know how to organize that in such a way that does not necessarily end up going into violence, that which the government then frowns upon. I don't know if I'm yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, that there's lack of knowledge on how to go about this, and there's lack of resources. In lack of that, what else can you do? The only thing that I would say the majority knows how to do, there's always that skepticism that if this happens, it could always get out of control. And in my mind, I'm like, how to resolve that? Resources and education. People need to learn that, okay, there's other ways to have that and still have it under control and still have your voice heard without, yes, before. I hope I was making sense. I think I said a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think it speaks to kind of disrupting that ignorance contract that people like Mills speaks about when he talks about epistemologies of ignorance. So I think what you're speaking to might be just around how we disrupt that, which is quite important. I think one last comment I'll make also is that there was a book, Qualitative Studies in Silence, The Unsaid as Social Action, which was edited by Kevin Durheim and Amy Jo Murray. So that might be a useful resource if people are particularly interested in silence and theorizations of silence.
Thank you, Santosh. I'm just being mindful of time, so I think we'll close there. But thank you so much for facilitating that rich discussion towards the end as well. I think we all appreciated it. So I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone and stop recording.
Thanks, Sheena, for